Hello, HIS72B Spring Quarter 2022. I'm happy to have you. I still haven't met you. Please don't feel like you have to watch all of these videos all at once. I just have time to record some of them now. I have broken Lecture 2 here into two parts. The first is language and concepts have histories, and the second part is words and phrases to avoid in this class and why. In part 1, we will start to think about some terms that will be central to this course. Language and concepts have histories, and words and concepts do not always stay packaged together. So, what is meant by sex? Science, body, woman? Is woman a sex? Is it a gender? How can each of these have a history? Is sex determined by or read onto the body? Is sex an act? What is sexuality? Sexual orientation? I want to tackle the sex-gender division. You may have learned these categories as sex is biological and gender is social. This binary is an heuristic method, meaning that it is a division that we as humans make to understand our very complicated world. Like most heuristic divisions, it has its uses. The problem comes in when people start to think that the categories that we create to make sense of the world are the only way of looking at the world. The sex-gender division did not exist until the mid-20th century. And although it was picked up by feminists in the 1960s and 70s, it did not originate with them. We will be covering where this heuristic binary originated later in the lecture. In the second part of this lecture, I am going to give you fair warning that there are certain words and phrases that you are forbidden to use in this class, in your writing for this class. And actually, I'd like you to steer clear of them in discussion as well. I've put these on the slide here, and we'll go through these again with the idea that repetition and explanation will help my dictatorial stance here make more sense. So the words are traditional and progress. And the reason is that they do a lot of behind the scenes heavy lifting. And again, I will explain that more in a moment. Starting off with part 1, language and concepts have histories. We will consider translations between languages of both words and concepts as we go on. But to start off today, we'll look at change over time in a single language. Since this is a U.S. history class and the class is in English, we will start by looking at change over time in this single language. The focus will be on certain words that are and will be important to this course. So we will not be covering lily-livered louse. The Oxford English Dictionary, or OED, is generally considered to have the most complete etymologies or histories for words in the English language. It has been constantly revised since its first publication in 1884 because words shift meaning with historical context. Our now will be history to future generations, and those generations will be perplexed or annoyed by our use of words familiar to them. This will be particularly true for words that they take for granted as unchanged, but also for words that they believe represent progress or advancement of some kind in their own time. Do not try to write down everything on each slide. I'm going to repeat that because I have people who do always. I might have been that person at one stage in my life. Do not try to write down everything on each slide. I will spend longer on some of the words we go over than on others, and the specifics are important here only in as much as they illustrate the big points. You most definitely do not need to memorize this information, but I do want you to understand that because words are used to describe and communicate about the world, their meaning changes over both space and time as societies change. I've illustrated that here with the word varlet, which you do not need to know for this class, although its history is extremely fascinating in terms of the historical context of gender and sexuality. There is no end point to this process. There is no actual meaning to a word in the long view. There is only the meaning that most people associate or associated or will associate with a word in a particular historical context. This is interesting to us here because when and how the word meaning packages that we will be looking at shifted is inseparable from other historical shifts in worldview and power distribution. I want to draw your attention to some important historical word meaning inflection points that I want you to file away in the back of your mind. So don't write everything down, but kind of file them away. You can look at the video again if when you need to. As we go through the course, you might want to look back at these words and notice how the changes in their meaning often correspond to historical shifts that we will be covering. Body, here the word body, has a fairly simple history, but there was one big change around 1200 that I'd like you to notice. When the physical, corruptible body became separated from the idea of an immortal soul. Before that, they went together. In the West, the meaning of the word science has changed much more over time than body. I know that this is too small to be read, so I am going to break it apart, but again, don't write everything down. Because I'm going to break it apart because the concept of science is completely tied to definitions of sex, gender, and woman, particularly in the period covered by this course. The origin of the word science was in Latin. The word was derived from the verb scire, which literally just means to know. So science was knowing or knowledge of any kind acquired in any way. We see the original Latin meaning reflected in the earliest use of the word in English in the Middle Ages. Any knowledge acquired by any means was science, and given the historical context, science was not separate from theology. The body and the spirit were split, but science was not peeled away from theology. The word fairly quickly went from just meaning knowledge to knowledge gained through study, accompanied by the division of science into particular fields. In the Middle Ages, the subjects of science were grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Those were the sciences. This tells us something about how medieval Europeans saw and organized their world. I am guessing that most of you do not think first and foremost of grammar when you encounter the word science. This is one of the shifts that I would like you to store away in the back of your mind for now. In the Renaissance, a science became any trained skill. For example, there was the science of weaving and the science of dyeing, meaning infusing cloth with color, not shifting off the mortal coil. In the early modern period, so think around 1600 just for ballpark, the idea of demonstrable truths was added to the meaning of science. This represents an important shift in worldview for Europeans. Science by this period had become associated with deliberate formation and testing of hypotheses and an attempt to define general laws that could explain sets of phenomena in a systematic way. Notice the emphasis on classifying as opposed to primarily explaining, and on the privileged place of vision, observed facts. We see this Western privileging of vision carrying through time in expressions like seeing is believing. In the 18th century, that would be the 1700s, we see some significant shifts in the idea of science that correspond to the ideology of the Enlightenment period. Don't worry if you don't know these periods. They come before the start of the period covered in this quarter, and we will not see them as much through the rest of the course. If we look at numbers 6 and 7 on the slide here, we see that scientific method was added as a requirement for something to be science. The big deal here is that theological and received wisdom, it has always been done, understood, whatever, in this way, those explanations took a back seat to what can be immediately perceived by human senses, particularly vision. Science started to be an entirely independent discipline broken into branches, none of which included grammar. Biology also was not yet included. In the 19th century, that would be the 1800s, there was another shift, one that built on Enlightenment developments. New fields like biology did not lend themselves to universal laws, the way that something like physics did. Previously, Isaac Newton and the law of gravity was pretty much the ideal of science. The word science was still shifting meaning slightly as ideas about what should be included as science grew in the late 20th century, well within the scope of both this course and my own lifetime. These changes and shifts will matter to us because sex, and especially sexuality as defined by the sex of participants, became important subjects of study, and science became an incredibly powerful, but not objective, way of organizing and understanding sex and sexuality in Europe and the US. If science became the field that appropriated the right to describe and define sexuality, medicine and all those who practiced it became the arbiters of what would be considered normal or pathological, pathological meaning diseased. I won't go through this word in detail, medicine. I will put a copy that you can look at under files. Do not feel like you need to memorize this, but I'll put a copy there so that you can explore changes that occurred in the meaning of medicine at the time periods in which particular changes happened. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that medicine was not really conceived of as a powerful profession until around 1966. Although the field began to gain legitimacy and cachet in the late 19th century, think 1870s to 1890s. That brings us to the word sex. Our course is on women and gender. If woman is a category of sex, how do we define sex? Anything that seems obvious, but is then actually difficult to pin down, is generally worth exploring more deeply. Let's see if we can easily pin down sex. In the Middle French at the top, we see sex with an E on the end as genitals. In the Middle Ages, we see the term applied to differing reproductive functions. So we've got something to do with genitals and reproduction early, but it only applied to humans and some animals. Plants did not have sexes until the English Renaissance. It was not until the early modern period, around 1631, that the word sex began to be applied to the roles male and female. The social or cultural role meaning would not be separated out into gender until the 20th century. We'll look at that next. And the meaning of sex as including the act of sexual intercourse or copulation did not appear until the very beginning of the 20th century. Again, don't worry about the fact that you cannot really see this here on the slide. The big points are what matter. I will break it down in the next few slides and include it in supplementary course material. What I want to draw your attention to here is the way that both social and biological scientists came to use the term gender differently to how it had been used before the mid-20th century, the way that it is still often, but not always used now. In the first decade of the 21st century, it was common to split sex and gender. Sex became a set of physical traits, a biological quality. Gender took on the cultural aspects of expected male and female behavior, the meaning that had been added to the word sex in the early modern period. If we look at the original meaning of the roots that became gender, they referred to grammatical categories. So gender was a science, but through speech and grammar. In the early Middle Ages, the meaning of gender expanded beyond grammar to mean any type or sort of thing, not only or even principally the kind of thing we associate with gender now. These two sets of meanings for gender, the narrow one that referred to language, number one, and the more broad sense of a class of things with shared characteristics, number two, both of those lasted in the word through the Middle Ages. It was not until the Renaissance, number three on this slide, that gender became associated with reproduction. And then it was through the word engendered, that which has been born, an offspring. You might also think of the word genitals here, the organs that involve engendering or production. It was not until the late Renaissance that the word gender took a meaning of a category of sex, and that's number four on the slide. Not until 1945 was the word gender split from the word sex in a way that we recognize now. Just to reiterate, this sex-gender distinction did not happen until the mid-20th century, less than 100 years ago. When the sex-gender distinction was made, it was done by psychologists. We will talk about why that matters to us later in the course. The split of sex as something biological and gender as social roles and expectations was picked up by feminist scholars in the second half of the 20th century. You can see this in the examples of the word use in C and D. These examples are from within my lifetime. Note that even the updated OED, as of the time I wrote this lecture, ends at 1981. But society has not stopped considering the issues behind the English words sex and gender. And just as a quick refresher, sex comes from secare, meaning to cut. Gender comes from gens, first meaning divisions of words into grammatical groups, and then meaning kind more generally, before becoming linked to reproduction, as in genitals and engender. If we were to catch the OED up, it tends to be glacial and, well, pre-global warming glacial and the changes that are made to it. We could note that gender is often used now to indicate a sense of self or identity. This differs from the idea of socially imposed roles, the feminist use of the word in the second half of the 20th century. The new meaning reflects current ideas and ways of organizing American society, emphasizing the way that individuals understand their relationship to American society as a whole. This is a word that I suspect may continue to see dramatic shifts in meaning. For now, this is a place to note that when you read the word gender in a text, you absolutely must note when the text was written, because the word denoted significantly different concepts in different times. Now, a practical application of what we have been talking about. Part 2, words and phrases to avoid in this class, and why. The word traditional, as well as all variants of it, is banned in this class. If you are inclined to use it, consider exactly for whom something has been a tradition and genuinely for how long. Beware of seeing progress as inevitable or having a consistent meaning across time and space. The idea that things get progressively better has a very specific set of histories in the US that are deeply intertwined with power differentials. Never, never use the phrases something has always been a certain way or throughout history something has been true. If you have friends who come into the course late, direct them to this slide, because throughout history is the bane or the poison of undergraduate essays. History studies change over time, and if something has been true throughout the past, then it's not really history, right? Key points for Lecture 2. Words and concepts are linked, but not in a simple one-to-one relationship. Both words and concepts, not to mention word concept packages, change over time. Make certain that you always know when your source text was written before you assume the meaning of any words like woman, gender, sex, science, medicine, and even body. The word traditional, as well as all variants of it, for example, traditionally, tradition, is banned in this class. Of course, you can use it in other places in your life, just not in my class. It is not at all uncommon for people to see progress as inevitable or to assume that it has a consistent meaning across time and space. Do not use progress in this class either, because what counted as progress in the past and what may even have been interpreted by you as progress had you lived in the past might seem quite regressive now, or just neutral. Never, never use the phrases something has always been a certain way, or throughout history, something has been true. Like many forms of popular culture, the movie Princess Bride, that's what this slide is referring to, it hasn't necessarily worn well with time, especially in terms of gender. However, it is still a source of great quotable lines. Given that changes in ideas about sex gender are part of what has made this movie out of step with culture now, this particular quote is all the more poignant. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. And the idea is that the person who's using the word is in denial of reality and is using a word for things where it doesn't really apply. Moral of the story is, as much as possible, know what a word meant in the context in which it was used, which may not be the same as the context in which you exist now, even if it's fairly close in time. Incidentally, the salient word for the slide was inconceivable. He kept saying that things were inconceivable as they happened before his eyes.